came out last year, but there was a lot of things, family stuff going on, and I've not actually done any talks about the book so far. So this is the first time I'm talking about what's in the book. Okay, let me see if I can. Okay. Is that fine? Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
That works.
Right. Okay. So we're going to look at what I've termed labor class children's work and schooling in urban India and central India. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework because that's one of the contributions of the work, but also it does allow us to see things that we sometimes miss. And it's particularly intended to also serve as a policy input. So that's something that I think using a certain framework has allowed me to provide a more nuanced account of children's lives in classrooms and families. And that then allows me to come up with more relevant inputs for policy and practice. So I'm going to spend roughly half of the time looking at the framework, why it's important, what it's adding to the story. And then I have some data about children's work, their gendered work. So we'll be looking at some of the data. And right. So there's so much text on my screen. Right. So why look at children's work in the context of schooling? And some of these debates would be familiar to a lot of you who are in the field, whether you're working in the social sector or in teaching or researchers like me. I've actually worked in different roles. I've worked as an NGO. In NGOs, I have worked as a member of Women Workers Union. I have worked as the research thing is the more recent bit, but I've done a lot of other things. I've taught children in informal contexts as well, and I've done some teacher training and science curriculum development. So you can see I was trying to keep like lots of options open in case I didn't get a proper job. But I've done lots of different things, and that's actually, I think, helped me build both. When I go for fieldwork, it helps me build relationships, but also it does allow me to see the limitations and possible potential in different ways of approaching the problems of inequality or children's work and so on. So right. So one of the reasons is the school labor binary that we are quite familiar with, where the understanding is that schooling is something that's an antidote to labor. So once children have access to schooling, all child labor disappears. That's all they need to do is to go to school. So what that has meant, though, in the Indian context, but also internationally in other developing contexts, it has also meant that there's more focus on expansion and provision rather than focus on the experience of schooling and how that is unequal for children from certain backgrounds, particularly low-income households and so on. So that's one reason. The other reason is also that a lot of reports, again, both national and international documents, continue to talk about poverty and educational marginalization as more societal and individual problems. So locating the children's work in schooling within a broader framework where we are looking at the social context and the economic context and the role of the state and so on, allows us to then move beyond this understanding of inequalities in economic and educational inequalities as individual or social problems. In the Indian context, particularly, the government has also deregulated child labor a few years back. So there are rules about, so there are age limitations, but at the same time, they've allowed children to work after school and in family enterprises. And family enterprises can be defined in lots of different ways depending on who's in charge. And so that definition doesn't really provide a lot of protection to children. They've also reduced the number of occupations listed, industries listed as hazardous in which children then cannot work. There's also a broader girl effect narrative, but there's a general understanding that girls, I'm talking about dominant understanding in policy discourses particularly, but also in some cases in institutions which train teachers and social workers and so on, is that that the families are the problem or the communities are the problem and they are more backwards. So that is what we need to address. There are schools, the girls are just not being sent to school. So looking at the gendered nature of poverty and work and their impact on schooling allows us to then unpick some of that narrative. And there's little more nuance. So rather than families being, girls being either heroines or victims, we are moving beyond that, but also we are not seeing families as either, very good or very all good or all bad. So there's more nuance to how things work for girl children within families and how families are located within economies. And that gives us a more nuanced picture of what's happening with girl children. Similar. The other reason I wanted to look at children's work was that it's an important index of inequalities in society. So that's why I was not concerned that much with the legal debates around it. I was also not looking at the pedagogical value of work, but looking at how it marks a certain kinds of inequalities between children from different social class backgrounds in current day India. So very broadly, there were two disciplines that I started with. One was the sociology of education, SOE, and the other thing was childhood studies. And I was looking at literature from both of these disciplines. And one of the primary critique that emerged was that within childhood studies, we were looking more at agency as an individualized concept rather than a relational and contextual one, and political economy being a blind spot. So that was something that scholars have pointed out needs to be addressed. Within sociology of education, this also is different, particularly in India, because the discipline itself was a latecomer to India. So, and a lot of funding, because it's a developing country, what's happened is that a lot of funding for research into education and work and poverty was driven by development programs and under the aegis of development agencies. So what happened is that there was very little theoretical development of the kind that we needed to unpick poverty. So as a structural condition and how it's shaped by caste and class hierarchies in the Indian context. Also, the institutes that train teachers were quite different, were literally located in a different space. So the distance between sociology and education as disciplines also was and continues to remain quite huge, actually. And that also affected the theoretical development of the discipline. The reason I'm harping on theoretical development so much is because it allows us to make links between macro and micro aspects of children's work. And that was something that wasn't happening in a very systematic fashion. So that's something that sociologists of education in India have repeatedly pointed out. So basically, this work was an attempt to respond to some of these calls to theorize things more systematically and pay more attention to political economy. So one of the main dimensions of the framework was informal work and the informal working class as a distinct location in contemporary capitalism. So for this, I've drawn upon Reena Agarwala's work, but basically there is a ton of work that's come out of Latin America where this kind of theorization first began, really. And they've continued to do very good, great work on this. So informal workers is the term that I'm using rather than informal sector, because informal workers can also be found in what's called the formal sector. That's increasingly the trend in India. And since the economic liberalization in the 1990s, it has only work in the informal kind of employment has expanded a lot more. So that affects the kind of work that parents have access to. And that is why the thinking through the lens of informal working class is more useful, because that's the bigger chunk of the population, and more than 90% of India's labor force is really informally employed. But then this economic inequality is also shaped by a history of caste inequality. So that is something that also needed greater attention. So what I did was I looked at both larger scale national level data to see how caste shapes access to the labor market and positions in the labor market. So where are parents based on their caste, how how does their caste shape what kind of informal work they have access to, how much they are paid, and so on. Because even within informal work, there's a gradation of wages, and working conditions can be different, and so I was looking at that. And then it has, again, with urbanization and with some kinds of legal changes, social changes, political changes in parts of the country, there has been some victories have been won, and marginalized groups have struggled and successfully struggled against certain kinds of discrimination. But at the same time, even now, land ownership, business ownership, size of the business can be like quite heavily shaped by caste background. So income status, whether you own your property, all of those kinds of things are affected by caste still. So in that sense, what's happening to the family depends very much on what kind of work parents are doing, and that is in turn also shaped by caste. I'll come to why I'm still then, why I'm looking at both caste and class, and not just at caste. So basically, there was caste patriarchy, there was informal work, and there were feminist critiques of global capitalism, which I was also drawing upon. So there's a lot of work that both actually childhood scholars and feminist scholars have done to critique children's and women's unpaid work within global capitalism. And they have particularly looked at how that has played out in neoliberal contexts now. So how has austerity then that interaction between austerity, informal economic informality, and at the same time the power relations of caste and gender. So that is within families, how that works for a household, how that works out, and at the same time, how does that work out in a wider society, and what kind of situations parents and children face outside of the home as well. So the data showed that, again, the groups that are marginalized already on the basis of caste are also facing greater exploitation within the informal work. The lower down you are in the caste hierarchy, the greater the likelihood of you being informally employed and having a lower income. So these kinds of things I got from national level data, which we are, by the way, no longer collecting. So I think I got lucky that I did work around the time a lot of the statistics was available, because the Indian government is no longer collecting a lot of the statistics, and we no longer have the institutions and the people in charge of the institutions who used to collect this kind of data. The third thing was looking at productive and reproductive labor, and how, and again, that's something that childhood and feminist studies scholars have looked at for some time, particularly in post-colonial contexts, how women and children have to pick up the slack when the welfare state shrinks and when the employers and the state withdraw from their responsibilities. The employer's case is particularly dire in India. So compared to some other Latin American countries, it looks like it's much worse in India. Employers get away with murder in India a lot better. But paying attention to some of these things has also helped me then see some of the small significant changes on the ground. So that has helped. I'll come to examples of that as well. So this was these were the broader, this was then the dimensions of the framework that I was using to locate children and their experience of work and schooling within families. So locating children within families, and then locating families within an economy and a social set of relations. The term that I used was labor class, but I've not proposed this as a new conceptual category. I think informal working class is enough of a category for us for analysis. This came into the picture because it was used by teachers, and it specifically referred to a kind of like, not only reflected lower wages and lower incomes for the parents, it also reflected a lower status, which is a devaluation of certain kinds of work within urban economies. It also captures how the more secular, modern-sounding term of class is used by teachers to then elide and obscure the discussion of caste in the Indian context. And it also captures how, so there's a lot more, I don't want to go into a lot of that detail, but I can talk about it a bit more if someone has questions. But it also captures how caste structures access to labor market in contemporary India. So that's where the term comes from. And teachers used to kind of say that, oh, these are labor class children, they are difficult to manage. These are labor class children, so they will behave like this only. So that was sort of supposed to then explain everything that was, quote, wrong, and quote, with the kids. So their class caste status was often being blamed for all of those issues. But at the same time, if we then unpack why people are undertaking certain kinds of labor, parents and families, and what's their position in the labor market, then a whole other story comes on. So the fieldwork was done in an urban Hindi medium school, a state government school. It's one of the few co-educational schools for teenage children, really. And the city of Indore is the commercial and financial capital of the state of Madhya Pradesh, which is smack in the middle of India. And you know why I've not used maps in the book or in my talks, because there's so much conflict over the map. So I always feel like that's like really stepping into a landmine to use a map of India. I don't know which borders to show. And also because I am, like I have an Indian passport, but I have a British affiliation, and the two countries use different maps. And most of my students at this point are Chinese. So I have a lot of fun, which is why I steer clear of maps of India. These children were in class 8. They were between 13 and 16 years of age. I did a classroom ethnography, so I observed the classroom, their interactions with teachers and peers, and I interviewed teachers and parents. I interviewed children in groups, individually, whatever they were comfortable with. I also visited homes and neighborhoods, sort of like a selected number, and I interviewed parents. So I've used the categories that the school was using for administrative purposes, and that was easier to do, and that data was also easier to get. And though it's not disaggregated data about caste and so on, it still gives us broader patterns which are worth looking into. So, okay. I'm now going to turn to some of the data that I have. This is mostly interview data about children's work and what was the nature of the work, how it's gendered and classed, how it's shaped by informal work in locations within a caste system, and also what drives this work. So with girls, one of the girls, I've used pseudonyms everywhere. Throughout, I've used pseudonyms for neighborhoods as well, for the name of the school, for individuals' names, all of that. So this girl, Arpita, she was about 14 years old, upper caste, and she'd migrated from rural Madhya Pradesh to the city of Indore. Her parents used to work in a garment manufacturing unit. These units are kept to a size which does not allow for collective bargaining or unionization. So that is something to be remembered when we're talking about informal workers. Her mother had had a complication following a pregnancy and had delivered a stillborn baby. So she was at home recovering, and the father had a heart attack. And because there was no health cover, or no health cover that any hospital was willing to accept, both of them had to quit work. So the older brother Arpita's brother was the first to quit school and take the father's place in the unit. And then Arpita also, because schooling was free till class 8, she was actually attending school, working at home, and working in the manufacturing unit. Her brother had gone beyond class 8. He had been very good, but they didn't have money for schooling, and beyond class 8, schooling was not free. So he had quit earlier. So it's not just about gender, it's also about age and the provision of education that determines which child works till what point and so on. And looking at the caste differences, because she was already upper caste and she was a rare upper caste girl who had to work and had a huge burden actually to carry. And that is why I also think it's useful to look at both economic inequality and caste inequalities. So this is a bit of data. If anyone is not able to read, just let me know.
I think it's fine, Reva.
Edward, do you have an opinion? Should I just read it out, or should I allow people to read in peace?
I think you can read it out. I think it's helpful, but it's also very readable.
So Sarita was another girl. She was a girl from a scheduled tribe background, and she had been living in a hostel, residential hostel, and Arpita kept wanting to go to a hostel herself. So Sarita was very happy to come back to her family, and Arpita was like, I need to run away. And part of the reason was that the amount of work that she had to do. And like you can see from the excerpt that they had borrowed money from the guy who managed the manufacturing unit. So there was also that debt. And they already had a lot of loans. So the children were also kind of paying off the loan before they could even start earning anything from their work. The other example is that of a girl from a scheduled tribe family. They had migrated from an even poorer state, rural Rajasthan, to urban Madhya Pradesh. And her mother was a domestic worker. Her father owned a paint business basically, and he really struggled to break even. And that's true for for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe business owners. These would usually be very small businesses which would really struggle because they wouldn't have the starting capital or the networks. Particularly the scheduled tribe families really struggled to find a living and manage businesses in the city because they just had no kind of networks at all. And Radha's older sisters were studying. They had finished class 8, so they were now paying for the schooling. So the family was spending on the girls' education, but the girls were also working as domestic workers, working with the mother. So that way, this gives a little. Radha's family was quite like, she was very angry with her mother for not allowing her to play, and she didn't have the kind of freedom that her younger brothers had. And because she wasn't working out for wages, she also wasn't able to go out of the house so much. But at the same time, her mother would fight with older male relatives in the family when they tried to police how Radha or her sisters dressed, where they went for their schooling and all of that. So the mother would fight the extended family, and the parents were spending on the girls' education after class 8. But at the same time, it was a really difficult life for Radha as well. So this is an excerpt from an interview where I was talking about what she did after school and so on, other than school, what she did. So there is a lot of work that she has to do, but what I was also finding, and I'll come to this in a little bit more detail, I can talk about this in more detail later, was also that in urban areas where girls are going to school a lot more, the division of labor has also changed. So I also came across a lot of boys who were doing care work. The problem with for girls was that they didn't have the degree of freedom that they had to move around in was quite different. And when they worked, they also didn't have the same control over their wages. If they were in wage work, they won't have the control. And if they're not in wage work, they're working at home, then they also didn't get paid. So it was more, they found it more exploitative. Radha and Arpita were some of the angriest girls as well in class, because they were quite upset with the teachers. They were quite upset with their parents as well. And they were upset with the neighbors for monitoring and policing them as well. So this gives us a sense of the kind of work that girls were doing and the reasons why they had to do this kind of work, with the kind of the way their parents' working conditions then made it necessary for them to take on certain kinds of responsibilities. If we look at boys' work, there were 4 kinds of work that they were doing. Like I said, they were also engaged in unpaid care work and a lot of emotional labor. Some of the boys were also doing, like trying to sort out fights and so on within the family, and looking after younger siblings and all that. They were also in wage work. Then there was a third kind of work, which I've called self-making practices and survival work in urban areas. They also worked because they didn't have access to leisure spaces. So that was also a classed kind of factor driving boys' work. And also, very interestingly, they were also subject to some kinds of moral policing like girls were. So there were stories of how boys got abused verbally or physically by an entire neighborhood for loitering outside. So for them to be outside was quite risky and dangerous. And so that was one of the reasons a lot of the boys preferred to actually work to pass time. And they didn't have access to the kind of leisure spaces that more middle-class children would have. I'll also give an example of how they found wage work more rewarding, even if when the wages weren't high. For some of the younger boys, they actually didn't know what the right, the going rate was for a certain kind of work or how to bargain with their bosses. So they would sometimes be working. There was a boy who would often go learn some work. He'd be very excited about learning it. Then he'll come back without taking his wages because he also wasn't supposed to work. So he had to lie to his parents. So he'd often forego wages, but he would go and try to learn things as much as he could. So what I found was that this work was far more rewarding for them compared to schoolwork, for example. But at the same time, very few boys had actually given up on schooling. So there was also that was very striking, that they were working. The money brought them certain kinds of independence, certain kinds of like they had more money to spend on clothes and music and so on. But at the same time, they weren't giving up on schooling because they also understood quite well the value of credentials. It wasn't so much whether they were learning or not. It was more like they knew quite clearly that credentials were important. They also, so in terms of the self-making or practices and survival work, what they were doing was, and again, there is this drawing upon broader literature on political economy, the political changes and the kind of economic and political conditions that low-income families deal with in urban India is quite useful, because what they were doing, even boys very young, 10 or 11 years old, was developing political and social networks to problem solve in daily lives. So they were, bus access to discounted transportation, so like bus passes and solving fights in the neighborhood, water supply, power supply, these kinds of issues very young boys were also solving. And because these were internal migrants, the families, the parents didn't have these kinds of networks. It was very young boys who were developing it. It wasn't always out of choice. It wasn't always safe or enjoyable, but it was a certain kind of labor, which is why I class it as labor. They had to undertake that work. It was classed, it was also gendered because boys had to be outside. They did not, again, that was not always by choice, though a lot of them enjoyed being outside. It wasn't always by choice. And so surviving conflicts in the neighborhood, so they had to be part of neighborhood networks to protect themselves against physical fights and so on. They also learned skills and trades and developed partnerships with young men in the neighborhood. So because they didn't trust the returns from education, quite rightly. And this also meant that in urban areas, they were breaking those kinds of boundaries between caste and religion. But at the same time, they were kind of hedging their bets, really. They knew that education is not very likely to deliver, particularly because school education is not all free. So after class 8, you still have 4 years of schooling to complete, but there is no provision for that. So they had to earn money to pay for the remaining 4 years, basically. Boys were often the first to be sent to work. Girls were really the last resort. So only the poorest families would send the girls out for wage work. But they had greater freedom to spend those wages, and that brought them greater bargaining power within the families, which the girls couldn't access. I've got 2 examples. Edward, how much time do I have? Sorry, I lost track of time. Can you really keep a timer?
Yeah, if you can sort of come towards an ending.
Yes, I just have this and another data example. That's all.
Oh, good. We're fascinated.
Oh, sorry. So this is an interview with the boy I mentioned earlier, who loved just go and learn any skill or trade that he wanted to. And if you look at the last bit of the interview, it's the way he frames it. His day revolves around work, not around school or anything else. He wasn't even hanging out with friends so much. So there was a certain satisfaction, and the way the boys would describe the work also showed how much meaning it had for them, and the continuity and the rewards of work came from that. The rewards came from the meaning it brought to them and a sense of purpose, having accomplished something. At the same time, like I said earlier, they didn't always make good deals. So they were doing a lot of work, but not really making enough money. And these were, a lot of it was also dead end work. It's not like there was structured ways of progressing through this and earning more money or so on, or building a life around that. So Rahul was again an upper caste, from an upper caste family. His mother was a domestic worker, father worked in a shop, and they had told him not to go for work, so he lied. There's another boy, this is the last example that I have. He was from the scheduled tribe. And again, here you can also see a little bit how urbanization means that sometimes the caste hierarchies are disrupted a little bit. They're not reversed like in a structural, larger scale, sustainable fashion, but at the same time, there are these individual efforts and networks make a difference sometimes. Ritesh was, his parents, his siblings were going for seasonal agricultural labor to different states, also neighboring states. And he was one of those boys who also started skipping school when halfway through the academic year, that school timings changed. And it's also important to note that because teachers didn't have the say, so the head teacher knew that this would be a problem. If school timings change, boys will not come to school, they will have to go to work. That was something that they had no platform where they could say that and, be listened to. So Ritesh was very much he had worked in a manufacturing unit which made notebooks and another one which made crisps. And he had figured out that this had more chances of bringing him upward social mobility than anything else. So he was sending money home, and he was also looking to get into the marketing side of the business. This is my last slide. So again, I'm just going back to the reasons why I think it's important to look at the broader context of poor children's work and schooling. If I've been looking at national policy documents, disappearing references to socioeconomic context, so that the lip service that was being paid is also not there. And it's mostly parents and teachers have to be monitored and managed. There are philanthropes and philanthropic organizations that have justified poor children's work, and they are also delivering SDG 4 goals around education. So that's something that needs to be problematized. Further privatization and so on, because expansion is enough. So if we think that children's labor can be just erased by providing schooling, then that means that we are just looking at expanding, even if it's privatization, rather than looking at the experiences of children's experiences in classrooms of schooling in general. What I'm seeing in India again, and this, I would like to know if this connects with people's experiences in other countries, but what I'm seeing is also that there is a whole set of new institutions that train teachers, teacher educators, and other development workers. But a lot of this broader history of debate around policy and children's work is disappearing, but also in some cases, not always, but also the realities that need to be engaged and the kind of joining up of policy that's required is something that's kind of getting ignored in some of these institutions. Thank you for your patience. I'm really sorry I don't know where I usually keep a timer and I forgot today.